Okay, so we've seen Spain's economy crater almost exclusively owing to their aggressive drive to embrace green energy. They have an EU leading unemployment rate of 20%, but unemployment for people 25 and younger is 45%. We showed an 8-year study that discovered that green energy killed 2.2 conventional jobs for every green job it created. But over time, 9 of those 10 green jobs disappeared because they were temporary construction or otherwise unsustainable roles. Once you install windmills and solar panels, the jobs go away. Excellent. But what about the problem of climate change and global warming due to greenhouse gases? Isn't reducing them worth the sacrifice to ensure that we leverage all the means of creating renewable energy? I mean, the point of all this investment and sacrifice is to deal with greenhouse gases and the irrevocable damage they will inflict on the environment, right? Let's look at these harmful substances and how they impact our environment, especially carbon dioxide, which comprises 84% of the total greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, according to the Energy Information Administration. Of that total, 97% of all CO2 is generated by fossil fuel combustion, according to this composition. The remaining substances consist of methane, which make up 9% of greenhouse gases, nitrous oxide, which makes up 5%, and hydrofluorocarbons, which make up 2% of greenhouse gases, according to the Environmental Protection Agency and the Energy Information Administration. No wonder everyone's so concerned about the effect CO2 has on the environment. But what makes greenhouse gases so harmful? Let's take a look at a basic diagram. When sunlight penetrates our atmosphere, it reflects off the earth, but some of the warmth gets trapped inside greenhouse gas molecules, which then radiate heat back to the surface. Before we delve further into the atmospheric soup, let's take a step back and recall what actually comprises our atmosphere. The vast majority of our atmosphere is nitrogen. Combined with oxygen, they consume 99% of the Earth's atmosphere. The starting point of greenhouse gases footprint contained within a tiny sliver of Earth's environment. Climate change zealots paint a doomsday portrait that our planet is being suffocated by CO2. Great. So we are now left to battle the demon of global warming, which is assaulting us from a stronghold inside a footprint totaling 1% of the atmosphere. Al Gore and the climate change activists are concerned about greenhouse gases in general, and CO2 specifically. Their fear is largely based on their assertion that 84% of greenhouse gases are coming from carbon dioxide, and 97% of that total is coming from fossil fuel combustion, which would explain their sense of urgency. That is, unless there were some inconvenient truth that would discredit this assumption. Introducing the most inconvenient element in the greenhouse gas conundrum, water vapor. Water vapor is described as a greenhouse gas in that it can capture heat from reflected sunlight and radiate it back to the surface. But the key question is how much water vapor is in the atmosphere compared to carbon dioxide and the other greenhouse gases? Are you kidding? Water vapor comprises 95% of all the substances defined as a greenhouse gas. And this is what's got everyone so excited? Wait, the facts get even more infuriating when you see what percentage of them are man-made. This chart says that man-made total contribution of greenhouse gases was 0.28%. So where did this alarm about CO2 get started, and how did it inherit one shred of credibility as having an effect on global warming? It's quite simple, really. If one leaves water vapor out of the analysis, CO2 looks like a monster. These charts were compiled from an aggregate of formal presentations from scientists who included water vapor. And you can see the tiny percentage that man contributed to the overall amount, with the exception of the various fluorocarbons, which only make up 2% of the non-water vapor greenhouse gases. If you look at each type of greenhouse gas and see the tiny percentage of them was man-made, you can see why opponents of global warming get excited. Let's look at a more empirical analysis of the greenhouse gas data pulled from reports from the Department of Energy, both with and without water vapor in the analysis. This chart summarizes the percentage of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere, but doesn't acknowledge the disparity of their global warming potential, nor does it include water vapor. In this case, man-made and naturally occurring CO2 would comprise over 99% of all greenhouse gas concentrations. Table 2 does take the varying heat retaining properties of different gases into account because methane and nitrous oxide have far more ability to retain and radiate heat than CO2, and this data also ignores water vapor. The GWP column stands for global warming potential, and it accounts for individual gases having varying levels of radiating heat. This chart shows that CO2 contributions drop from 99% concentration to 72.37% of all greenhouse gases when you factor in CO2's lower heat radiating properties. The numbers look vastly different when water vapor is included. The total atmospheric amount of CO2 plummets from 72.37% to 3.62%, and the man-made portion drops to 0.11%. The total man-made contribution of greenhouse gases comes crawling in at 0.28%. One can only wonder if there would be as many people concerned about global warming if researchers didn't ignore the presence of a substance that represents 95% of all greenhouse gases. Let's look at various charts meant to represent greenhouse gas data that try to show the sources of output by various industry sector activities. This chart from Australia breaks down all greenhouse gas output by various domestic activities, and this Canadian chart shows which industries were the biggest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. This chart from India credits CO2 as producing 64% of their greenhouse gases, and this US chart credits a total of 84% of all greenhouse gas emissions to CO2. These US charts break down all greenhouse gas types by industry and activity. Has anyone noticed a consistent theme? Not one of these charts from any of these countries even consider the existence of water vapor as a greenhouse gas. Consider this screenshot from a glossary of terms on the EPA website. It gives the official definition of greenhouse effect and includes water vapor in the definition. Yet in the chart of global warming immediately to the right, it lists 8 different hydrofluorocarbons among the 16 separate gases that contribute to global warming, but leaves out water vapor. We would love a salient explanation for this. This screenshot from the Environmental Information Administration removes all doubt. It identifies water vapor as the most abundant greenhouse gas, but because it is not produced by man, they just ignore it because it would implode the argument that CO2 levels are driving up temperatures. Water vapor has the properties that make it as much of a greenhouse gas as CO2, so someone has to explain why a substance that makes up 95% of a scientific atmospheric sampling is purposely ignored by scientists. The global warming zealots have no choice but to ignore water vapor, or their argument shrinks to the same impotent level man-made CO2 does in its ability to impact global warming at 0.11% of all greenhouse gases. They give themselves a convenient and myopic excuse for their position by calling the phenomenon anthropogenic global warming, which has a literal definition of man-made. Water vapor is 99.999% naturally occurring, so they conveniently rule out water vapor when discussing anthropogenic global warming, merely by the self-serving pretzel logic that water vapor is not anthropogenic. By that logic, a ski resort that opened its season with 12 inches of powder and another 12 inches of fresh man-made would make radio ads boasting about their 1-foot blanketing the slopes, right? Given the staggering percentage of greenhouse gas that consists of water vapor, ignoring it is intellectually deceptive in its best light.